What do you think of when you imagine statues from ancient Greece and Rome, also known as the classical era? Most people imagine an incredibly lifelike, polished, gleaming white figure. Whether it be displayed in a movie, video game, or museum, we have come to recognize the iconic style of classical art. However, this is a very inaccurate portrayal of what statues made in ancient Greece and Rome actually look like. Instead, the white marble we see in classical statues wasn't the finished product, it was simply the canvas. Classical art was originally painted with bright colors and beautiful designs. Surprised? Most people are, despite over 300 years of evidence that support this theory. We're going to unpack the history, racism, and future of monochrome classical art to understand art history's best-kept secret. The white marble aesthetic of classical art was born out of the Renaissance when classical art was starting to get discovered. While the statues were originally painted, their paint began to wear and their pigment became hidden under hundreds of years' worth of dirt and calcite. While visiting the Acropolis in Athens in the 1880s, American art critic Russell Sturgis described what was happening to the statues shortly after being dug up. The color of all of these soon began to fall and vanish. The beautiful statue, first described, lay on a table in the museum on the Acropolis in May 1883, and already some of its colors had been shaken off, for as it lay, it was surrounded by a little deposit of green, red, and black powder which had fallen from it. Alright, so what's the problem? Clearly, people from over 100 years ago said that paint simply fell off due to the statues being so old. So why don't we know about it? Well, remember how classical art started to get discovered in the Renaissance? People quickly became amazed by the statue's incredible realism but lack of color. Soon, artists started copying that style and placed emphasis on form rather than color in order to pay homage to classical art. Over time, this style of art was seen as an elite Western form of art. Soon, scholars were promoting the idea that there was a connection between whiteness to humanism, civilization progress, and moral purity. Joan Winkelmann, often considered the father of art history, made his remarks on classical art, saying, "The whiter the body is, the more beautiful it is." In an exhibition of Pompeii, Winkelmann actually discovered a polychrome statue of Artemis that had been preserved in the ash. However, he continued to dismiss the statue and claimed that it was not Greek, but rather Etruscan, a civilization in Italy that thrived centuries before the founding of Rome. By this time, the stance of the art history community was clear, with Johann Wolfgang van Gogh stating, "Savage nations, uneducated people, and children have a great predilection for vivid colors, and people of refinement avoid vivid colors in their dress and their objects that are about them." Throughout the 1900s, multiple excavations showed again and again that there was color visible to the naked eye on classical statues. However, the stance remained the same in the face of countless pieces of evidence showing that classical art was originally polychrome. Historians and collectors went so far as to continuously scrub and bleach classical art to maintain the aesthetic of whiteness, including the Parthenon marbles in the British Museum, which are permanently damaged by this process in the 1930s. It's no coincidence that classical art continues to be inaccurately presented. Throughout the centuries, classical art has been used to spread white-centric ideas and has continued to be used to spread alt-right propaganda. The Apollo of the Belvedere, in particular, became a tool to justify racist practices. The proportions of the statue were measured and used to create the cephalic index, which ranked and categorized people based on the width and length of their features. However, as anthropologists continued to measure people for this theory, they quickly found little merit, and would then actively mismeasure people and simply state their racist prejudice as fact. This led to the making of numerous anatomical models with these proportions to be used in the medical field, as well as perpetrating an idea of whiteness in the classical era that was never there. The obsession with whiteness in classical statues has led to multiple links in classical art and white supremacy. During the founding of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Ralph Cram, a founder of the museum, argued while discussing what should count as classical art, "Forget the archaeology of Babylonia, Crete, and Egypt. Realize that the great sequence is from Greece to Rome." America has always aligned itself closely with ancient Greece and has projected whiteness onto classical art to maintain a false idea of race and Western civilization. The likeness of the ancient Greece has been used over and over as a pathetic attempt to justify oppression in American society, including slavery. After the Civil War, there was a rise in neoclassical statues to commemorate Confederate generals. The purpose of using the neoclassical style was to create another connection between America and ancient Greece, which has constantly been presented as a racially homogeneous society. And it's not just America that clings to the classical era. Western Europe is also seen aligning itself with the idea of power and racial homogeny. In fact, the BBC recently looked at how classical art was used in the rhetoric of Nazi Germany and said, "Without the classical tradition, the Nazi visual ideology would have been rather different. The perfect Aryan body, the white color of the marble, the beautiful, ideal white male, to put it bluntly. It became the kind of image of the Herrenrasse, or master race, that's what the Nazis called themselves, and the Germans." And we still see classical art being used to justify racism. Take Identity Evropa, an American white supremacist group that consistently uses classical art to align themselves with ancient Greece and promote neo-Nazi propaganda. And while not all the consequences are as prevalent as literal fascist movements, there are still consequences to inaccurately presenting classical statues. For instance, the lack of color in statues heavily contribute to the idea that ancient Greece and Rome were racially homogeneous, despite the fact that these societies ranged from northern Africa to the Mediterranean. In all likelihood, many of the people depicted in these classical statues weren't white, yet there is still practice of gatekeeping the classics field. As a study in 2018 found, 98% of scholars within the classics field are white. By continuing to present classical statues out of context, we are actively pushing an inaccurate and highly racist narrative. I think the best way for people to start understanding classical statues is to see them how they were intended to be seen. By using technology, scholars have been able to determine the color of their surviving microscopic pigments left on the statues. They have been able to use design programs to retroactively create what they believe to be an accurate copy of the polychrome statue. A really cool example of this is the Temple of Augustine Peace, located in Italy. There, they have programmed 3D goggles to show the temple in the original color. This proved to be a massive success and caused no harm to the priceless artifacts. Now, is it realistic that every museum hires multiple designers and programmers to create exhibits such as this? No. But there are definitely some big-name museums, such as the Met, that could definitely have the resources to do this. And smaller museums could simply use 3D printers to create smaller versions of the statues in their original colors, as well as host events that bring speakers in to educate the community. Will seeing classical art in color fix all the racism that surrounds classical art and is intertwined to the classics field as a whole? Absolutely not. This is simply a proposed step to start the process of dismantling racism in classical art by giving people the context needed to lead to greater discussions about the interactions between art and race, how color or lack thereof affects our interpretation of art, and who has the power over what is presented. If you're interested in learning more about this, you should definitely check out the Gods in Color Art History digital exhibit. It's really, really cool, as well as Hyperallergenic, which has a lot of articles about this topic. They're really, really interesting. And if you've learned anything or want to talk about this with anybody, please do. This should be a conversation that has so many people involved and not just art history students. If you have any ideas about how museums should better do this, you can write to your museums about it. Get involved. It's really fun, I promise. That's all I have for you today. But yeah, bye.